Hi guys, I hope you're well. I just wanted to make a quick video to highlight some of the lessons and things I've been finding out over the last few days since the new version of Claude 3.7 has been released, and some tips and tricks that I think you can take away from it and that will allow you to build really powerful systems, particularly on the coding side in terms of what it can do. I'd honestly say, having tried a lot of different LLMs and AIs over the years, this is probably about the best that you'll find. And there's one very key reason for that, and that is its willingness to output a lot of code, frankly. When we first started with the likes of GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, in the very first versions of it, they might output, 200, sort of 250 lines of code at a push. When we got to the more recent versions of 4.0, that was getting up to more sort of the 500 lines, and maybe Claude 3.5, sort of in March time last year, could do that kind of 600 line sort of amount. With O3 Mini, I saw that pushed up to sort of 900 lines to 1,000 at the absolute max. The OpenAI one really resisted going further than that. Um, but with the latest version of Claude, they've really pushed the boat out, and it will pretty much just keep going. So I found that in one sort of setting, one file, you can get up to at least 2,000, 2,500 lines of code without much trouble at all. And it's basically only limited by the length of its output window. It's 8,192 tokens, I believe, with for a total context of 128,000. However, you can use the continue method to make it keep writing the code as it keeps going. So it's not a hard cap, but it's a bit of a soft cap, as then it can often get confused if it's editing a file and working on it exactly where it is. So you start to kind of accumulate more errors and things. So to kind of demonstrate this, what I've done literally just this evening, over probably on about 2.5 hours, 3 hours, something like that, is build a kind of sample game, a JavaScript game. It's kind of a text-based. There's no graphics to speak of. Um, Pretty much solely with Claude writing the code, it correcting the errors as we go. Me just doing a very small amount of fixes. So you can see this is some of my conversation history with it, and it's been me pasting different things and kind of going back and forth between it. I'll just give you a quick example here so you can see that it works, and it's quite fully featured in terms of what it can do. Obviously, there's still some bugs, and it's not completely perfect yet, one thing or another, but it's still a pretty impressive um, showcase of what it's capable of doing. Um, you know, it's one of those things. Obviously, I could do it myself, but it would take a very long time to do. But what's most impressive is really, I'll just make that a bit smaller now, is the amount of code that was contained within it that's required to run it. So we can see index.html, and I know there's some blanks here, but look, you get down to 1100 lines, the core game.js file, almost 5,000, and then a config file that's almost 300 lines. So you kind of put that together, and you've got something that's excluding blank spaces, let's say, over 5,000 lines of code. And whilst I know that you know lines of code is not an exact proxy for how complex something is, in terms of orders of magnitude, it can start to give you a pretty good idea. There's a big difference between a 500 line application, a 5,000 line, and a 50,000 line, and a 5 million line application. Okay, so if you think about levels of complexity, some like bigger game engines from the earlier period, they'd be often in the hundreds of thousands of lines of code, sort of 200,000 lines. You get to kind of game engines nowadays, Unreal, sort of in the, probably one to, a couple of million lines of code, things like that. So the point being that you can start to write pretty complicated programs pretty quickly, and so the power of it is only going to increase. And surprisingly, actually, Claude today, it seemed to do pretty well, even just editing this single game.js file, which is up to 4,800 lines of code. Although I did notice I got better results at the end when I was telling it just to edit specific pieces rather than try and rewrite the whole thing over and over again. So what you can do is think about how you want to divide up your pieces of code basically that you're working with. So if you can ideally get them to start and to finish sort of under 2,000 lines, then you're going to be in a pretty good place going forward. And then there's some other techniques I've found that I think it's worth noting to really get you in this mindset and allow you to build applications that are kind of infinitely scalable, where you can have Claude or other AIs writing different parts of it. So the first step you're going to want to do is to come up with a very detailed spec. So if you put yourself in the mindset of a software engineering manager, you're going to have a much better shot at this basically. So what that means is coming up with your ideas, and I often use a voice dictation and transcribing software to come up with an initial prompt. And you want to work this up and you want to kind of give a spec. So if you can break down your application, as I said, into modules that can be roughly about 2,000 lines of code long each, 2,500 at a push, and you can specify the input and the output arguments and the kind of the structure of it and what it looks like and with the stubs for that, then you're going to be in a very good position going forward. So you kind of want to have that in your plan, have the context ready for Claude to understand what it's trying to build. And there's another couple of parts on top of that as well. You need ideally a loosely coupled method of communication between these different components. So something like a messaging bus, so that they don't have to, be wired in directly to each other. They can kind of put the different components can put messages on a bus and listen for them, and it kind of reduces single points of failure, and it can make applications, on the one hand, sometimes a little bit harder to debug and figure out where messages are going, but on the other hand, they're harder to break, and they're often more resilient. Um, and I think they fit better with Claude in terms of what it can code. And if you can keep going down that route and adding modules with this kind of central bus idea, well then you can keep expanding the size of your application and using Claude to constantly write the extra parts of the code for it. So that's a really powerful way, I think, of building applications and extending them. So it's coming up with a detailed spec. It's coming up with a kind of bus type central messaging architecture and thinking about it as micro apps, microservices within what you're trying to build. And then, just really going forward with that, and also lastly, being very clear with Claude. We're saying, I want you to go and write the code for step 1 or step 2 or step 3, so it knows exactly what it's trying to do. So essentially you're putting yourself in the mindset of a software engineering manager. Claude is at the point where you can really treat it as a digital employee in my book. I mean, as I said, here you're probably around, almost 5,000 lines of code. On a very, very good day, I could probably do 1,000 lines of code, and that's assuming I was kind of within a domain and didn't have to interact too much with external APIs or these things. So this would be a really significant piece of work. And what I've also done for everyone in this community, I'm going to attach here a Google Drive link to the source code, the complete source code for this game. So you can see it, you can break it down, you can have a look at it, you can see how Claude is creating and kind of working with it. As I said, it's quite a long way from perfect. There's still bugs, there's still redundancies. You'd use the config file a bit more and these kind of things, but it is quite playable. It was inspired by a game from, I don't know, a Palm Pilot called Space Trader a very long time ago. And it demonstrates pretty complex interactions. The UI and the theming and the styling, again, all created by Claude. And hangs together actually pretty well. It has required a few rounds of bug fixings, one thing or another. I've done pretty minimal changes on it myself, to be honest, in terms of bug fixing. There were literally only a couple that Claude was getting a bit stuck on, and that was often very kind of simple reordering. And the thing is, that then gives you a 5,000 lines of code starting point. I'm not saying necessarily you want to take this game going forward, but I more mean using that principles we've described to get yourself a really pretty complicated application going. And to be honest, this is not as well broken down as it could be. We could certainly, and I have another sample I'm going to be working up over the next week or so over a multiplayer um, sort of a ship pirates kind of simulator kind of game, where we do demonstrate some more of these bus methodologies, and and how you can use that to extend and build a scalable application with AI. Um, but yeah, as I said, what you don't want to do is just put in a single sentence prompt about what you ask it to make. It's too general. You need to give it more context, and you need to give it the structure of how to build it. So as I said, think of yourself as a software manager. Think of yourself as your team of digital employees, of software engineers, and honestly, the code quality here is it's best I've seen out of any LLM, and it generally often just works. Other ones they'd get a lot of the syntax wrong, or they'd use different versions of libraries that weren't right or incompatible. They get confused about using different elements of syntax and functions from kind of mixing them from different versions of popular packages. This doesn't seem to happen here. I found it's also a good technique if you you tell it to use a single HTML file and single JavaScript file, single config file, so you can kind of combine them together if you want to. It makes it easy to run. As I said, to be more scalable, you'd split things out and keep going forward down that path as well. So yeah, the Google Drive link will be up for this. You should just be able to kind of load these into VS Code. I'd suggest you get an extension called Go Live, which is basically a browser, server that sits kind of within VS Code. It's pretty popular. I think that we have in here. So look at extensions. So if I'll just show you briefly, Go Live saves you having to set up a whole kind of sort of web server. Okay, I'm not sure where it is, but yeah, that's a good way to our live server. Maybe that's what it'll be, to basically run this file, or run. Here we go. This is what you want. So this is a good extension to get, and it's what I'm using. It's got a lot of downloads there, so it's a good way to then allow you to serve static websites kind of without needing a whole server stack and hosting setup. It just is a VS Code extension, so it's nice and straightforward to use. So yeah, I hope you find that useful. As I said, I think Claude is currently probably state of the art in my opinion for coding. I'd see where it goes from there. And as I said, I'm going to be continuing with this series on kind of more advanced prompting and coding, and seeing how we can get our teams of digital employees going, and also working up this infrastructure and methodology for prompting in a detailed way that works with having multiple agents. Write your code and build large scale applications, because that's where the power really is coming out, where you can say, you start doing something that would taken somebody a year to do. That at that point you can then build applications where it normally wouldn't have been worth it, but now it is. So the marginal cost of each new line of code is trending towards zero, and that's going to allow you to do more exciting things that maybe before you wouldn't have been able to. So thanks very much for watching. I hope it's helpful. Be very interested to see any comments or feedback that you have. Thanks a lot.